Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Richard Morco, and this is the Long Hill Report. And today we are extremely fortunate to have as a guest Tom Chamberland. And Tom Chamberland, in the April issue of the Sturbridge Times Town and Country Living magazine, warned the populace about ticks. Weather was coming, and the ticks are out there, and they see you as a meal. They see you as a veritable supermarket. So, Tom, I'm going to let him introduce himself as what he's been doing, what he does, and then he can talk to you about being aware of the ticks.
Well, Richard, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. Appreciate it. My experience with ticks probably goes to the fact that I, for some 40 years, was a park ranger with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For the most part, I spent my career here in Sturbridge and the Charlton area, working at the various flood control dams that are operated in the area by the Corps of Engineers. So being exposed to ticks was, quite frankly, a job hazard that we had to address every summer. It seems like now that ticks seem to be more prevalent throughout the year. Not sure why that is directly, but now you can almost guarantee finding a tick almost year-round. Nature of being outdoors, and clearly I've enjoyed the outdoors, lived with it. I've had ticks bite me, so to speak. Had them removed properly and been tested, and to date been very fortunate not to have contracted Lyme disease. But it is always something that I'm aware of when I'm in the outdoors.
Is there some tips you want to give to the people?
Well, there's, first of all, there's a lot of information out. This is a little handout I just picked up today at our Board of Health office in Sturbridge. These are available at all the local Board of Health offices, so if you're looking, to some material on ticks, it's out there. Obviously, the magazine article I wrote back in April, and I think, if you go to your library, what have you, there's a wealth of information there to follow up on. I really do not profess to be an expert on ticks. So if you ask me, can you identify one tick, the deer tick, from a dog tick to a Texas tick, quite frankly, I'd be guessing more than scientifically saying I'm correct. But some tips. Well, one of the first tips that I tell everybody is one for yourself. You can see that I'm dressed in basically some light clothing, or where I have skin, obviously it's open and it's visible. So checking yourself for ticks as you go out, as you enjoy the outdoors, monitoring yourself when you come in at the end of the your session outside, whatever that might be. That's really the best prevention is observation and checking yourself. Beyond that, some people have said, well, gee, what about my yard and never mind being out on the trails or what have you. Ticks prefer grass that's at least somewhere around 6 to 8 inches high to hay fields. They also they're kind of opportunistic, thank you, to hitchhike or attach themselves because they are seeking a warm-bodied person. They need the blood out of your system to complete their life cycle. So they really hitchhike on any mammal out there, from deer to field mice to your dog, your cat, in the farmyard, your farmyard animals, your horses. Just about any warm-blooded animal is susceptible to picking up and having ticks on them. So, knowing that if you have animals in your yard, if you have your dog or your cat, checking them routinely, especially if they're an outdoor animal, I think is very important. Excuse me. Beyond that, like I said, the ticks like tall grass, so keeping your grass properly mowed, 3 to 4 inches high, is a good preventative. But that edge area between your lawn and the woods would clearly be a good tick habitat. There are some sprays out there that try to reduce and minimize ticks landing on that. I'm not going to really recommend any one over another. And also I recognize that some people, not only do they control ticks, but a lot of the insecticides and pesticides will also affect beneficial insects. So it's an individual decision that you really need to make in your yard as to whether you want to go to that level or type of control.
Okay. Let's see. So you basically covered everything
Yeah, in a nutshell, again, I think when you're dealing with ticks, there are some generalizations. Just because a tick is on you doesn't automatically mean you're going to contract Lyme disease. Although every person is different, the general rule of thumb out there in the literature that I've read kind of says that if a tick has started to bite you, that if you can get it off within the first 24 hours, that usually greatly reduces the ability for transmission of any of the diseases. And of course, Lyme disease being the most prevalent one. But clearly, once you are bit, if you're concerned, you can save the tick and put it in a plastic Ziploc bag, tight bag. You can send it off to UMass, and they will test it for you and let you know whether they will identify it and test it for Lyme disease and several other diseases if you so choose. I understand there is a minimal cost for I believe the basic test is free, but if you want them to run additional tests, there is some charge for that. So they'll get back to you with that. Clearly, contacting your primary care physician, and letting them know that, you've been potentially bit by a tick. They may want to call you in and as a course of care, put you on antibiotics. One of the more telltale signs of a tick bite and potential Lyme disease is the bullseye ring. So around the bite area, you'll find a ring. The diameter may be anywhere from a size of a quarter to 2 or 3 inches or even larger, but it'll definitely have a telltale darker ring. If you see that, that's really a sign that you should definitely go see your doctor and have them look at it and potentially get you on some antibiotics. Not always, though, do you see the ring. You may just see a red area. It may be an itchy spot that takes 3 or 4 or 5, 6 days, a persistent itchy area. Again, if that's an area where the tick has bitten you, that would be a warning flag to maybe get checked out and see your doctor.
The deer tick itself is rather small compared to a lot of other ticks, is it not?
Well, there are, like I said, there are 3 general types in our area. There is the deer tick, which is a very tiny tick. Usually the mature size is about the size or the diameter of a pinhead, for those people who remember the pins from sewing. So basically the diameter of a pencil line, relatively very small. So they are hard to detect. The dog tick generally is slightly larger tick, and usually a dog tick, you'll generally feel that walking on your skin because of its size. And also the Texas tick, the black Texas tick, is also slightly larger and easier to see. The deer tick, in and of itself, I think the deer get a bad rap. because everybody says, well, you need deer for deer ticks. Well, yeah, you do, but they're the ones, really mice and moles, squirrels and chipmunks are really animals that vector the deer tick much more than deers do. So again, it's just about any warm-blooded animal that we have running around in our woods is susceptible to having ticks latch onto them and completing their life cycle and continuing to reproduce.
If, if generally speaking, the larger ticks that are not the vectors of, don't infect us with the Lyme disease, they're easier for us to detect. But, just out of curiosity, because I've had my share of ticks, and I've always gotten them off. If somebody left the tick there, or it was a place they couldn't get to, what would happen? Would the tick just let go eventually when it got the full blood meal?
So the tick basically gorges itself on blood, and at the point where it has gorged itself enough, it will eventually drop off and then complete its life cycle of living off of the blood to produce the eggs and the future lineage of deer ticks or ticks to continue on. Usually when the tick has been latched long enough that it's become engorged, it becomes a little more of a challenge to remove, because you definitely want to make sure you remove all of the parts of the tick from your body. So usually if they're starting to get engorged with blood, the head has bored into your skin subcutaneously a little bit, and that might be a little more difficult to get out. So again, if you, there are many types of tick tools out there for tick removal. The one that I routinely use is a fine pointed pair of tweezers. There are a number of other tools. Some have kind of like a V-shaped where you could scrape it and with the V-shape pull it out, try to gently remove it from you. There's some other wives' tales, so to speak, or grandmother remedies of touching it with a hot match, putting on Vaseline or Vicks Vapor Rub, some type of greasy substance to suffocate it, and hopefully it'll remove. And again, those, they may or may not work. Usually I just do the tweezers, pull it off, make sure you got it all, look at it carefully. Like I said, if you want to get it tested, or if you just want to save it and say, well, let me see what happens. Do I develop, put it in a Ziploc bag, to save it for the future. You can look at it obviously with a microscope to make sure you got the head and what have you. But then the routine first aid that I do is I would take some type of antibacterial ointment, put a little dab of that on the wounded area and cover it with a Band-Aid, and then just kind of monitor it. Again, your level of comfort, whether you want to call the doctor or not, your primary care physician, that's your call to make. But I've been fairly fortunate that, like I said, I've been a number of times and have not yet, to date anyway, contracted Lyme or any of the other diseases. So, and I think, Rich, you asked me a little bit about that. Yeah, Lyme disease is probably the most prevalent that we hear about all the time, but there are a number of other diseases that different ticks will carry. I'll profess, like I said, I don't know the names of all of the diseases. Some of them have some interesting effects on the human body, between achy joints and flu-like symptoms to actually being allergic to red meat. There's a number of different problems out there with the ticks. And so it's always best to be vigilant. Like I said, every day do that tick check.
Well, I do remember that I once got bitten by one, and it was not Lyme disease, didn't give it, but I was headachy and in bed for about 3 weeks. I had actually to be rehydrated twice in the emergency room. And there were some exquisite hallucinations, which I said sort of was a reward for my not doing drugs in the 60s. But it was a bad experience. So you really want to get those, and that's one of the reasons I ask about, well, if it just stays on there, will it just drop off? And did I not notice this or something? Because, I mean, I shower regularly, and I check myself in the shower as best I can, but what, as my achy joints get older, there's only so much I can pull, there's places you might miss. So it is a very important thing to check yourself if you like the outdoors. If you're a recluse, never goes out, you can disregard this.
As long as you don't have a dog.
Yeah, as long as, yeah. Otherwise, well, kill the dog. No, I don't.
Right.
So it's a very, very, even without Lyme disease, it was a very harrowing experience.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to see you're better now.
Well, it was about 20 years ago.
Okay. Yeah.
A friend of mine from close to the Cape, she had it, and she had kind of a similar thing. I didn't get a diagnosis of what the tick, what kind of she had some babiosis, I don't know how it's pronounced. Is that right?
Pretty close, yeah.
I said, if anybody was going to get a disease, a babe disease, it would have been you. And that was ameliorated. That ameliorated a little bit, but not much.
Right.
But it's really bad, and I don't think it's been as bad as some years this year.
Well, ticks, like anything in nature, respond to the weather that we have. There also, the good news is there are some other animals that routinely eat ticks as part of their diet. Turkeys, possums, some of our native birds. So, encouraging wildlife in your yard to come in would be one natural way of controlling ticks, or at least, offering some control that way. A lot of people, encourage birds to come in their yard by feeding them.
Yeah.
The issue I have with that is if you're feeding them, then the birds aren't naturally looking for food,
Right.
which would be, the ticks. So, something to consider with, not only feeding birds, in this area of a little bit of tick control, but also the resulting, I think we've all known that, one of the things that attracts bears into our yards is bird feeders.
Yeah.
So, this time of year where, there's plenty of food naturally out there for our wildlife, I strongly encourage people to, let the wildlife enjoy nature's bounty, whatever that might be, and not necessarily supplement it with bird food and leaving, feed out for the wildlife at all.
How about chickens? Are chickens?
Chickens will also eat ticks.
Really? I didn't
Yes,
know
they will. Like I said, just about, there's a number of birds that will go after ticks. Any ground feeding bird, like, chickens, partridges, pheasants, our turkey population, possums, though not a bird, I think are one of the other.
They've gotten a good rap.
Right.
The possums, and they're not the geniuses of the animal kingdom. In fact, from an evolutionary point of view, they're kind of just a hangover, because I guess North and South America had lots of marsupials at one time, but now they've just been outcompeted by regular mammals. So, you're looking at a little bit of Australia there.
Right. Yep. The weather does play some control, or can. Ticks are susceptible to very low freezing temperatures. So if we had a winter with very little snow and a lot of really cold temperatures where the ground is exposed and we get a good depth of frost into our natural landscape, not necessarily, you know, in the roads and our lawns, but, you know, in the wooded areas where the duff layer would actually insulate the ground, so you need that little bit more of cold to kind of penetrate through that. You know, that provides some natural control too, but again, it's a very specific, you know, unique winter circumstance that we need to have.
And nothing we can do.
Right. And most of our recent winters, you know, have not been that severely cold where we get below zero temperatures for several nights in a row. And again, that's the, you know, the kind of minus, you know, below zero nights we would need, you know, to really affect a good control in the tick population.
Okay, well, I can wait for winter. I don't need to go back to winter to get rid of ticks. I assure you. It's good that it happens.
Yes.
But, this was you know, every winter is interesting, and
Yep.
Every winter is a little harder.
That's what's so great about New England, as they say, you know, wait an hour and the weather will change, you know. So, yep, I thoroughly enjoy living here in New England.
I do too. I do too. Well, if you have anything else about the tick.
Yeah, I think just to, you know, a little bit to you know, summarize it. Ticks are out there. We need to know about them. We need to educate ourselves. We need to be looking for them if we go out. Again, you know, the light clothing, or definitely, you know, checking yourself when you come in, checking your pets, obviously the children. Keeping, you know, if you're just out in your yard, keeping your lawn properly mowed. You know, keeping the brush trimmed back around the edges of your yard if you abut, you know, woods, a wood or natural area. Again, the ticks like that brushy stuff from between 6-8 inches to about 3 or 4 feet high. So if you can keep the trees well trimmed and the brush down, that minimizes that, at least in your yard. If you go out on the trails, hiking, you know, try to stay to the center of the trail as much as possible, so you're not up against the mountain laurel and the natural shrubbery that we find, you know, in our trail areas. But again, checking yourself, you know, that's the key, is check, check, check.
Okay, we have another affliction this year. The gypsy moth is back.
Oh, yes.
And I heard you talking to Dick about what's going on. If you could tell people what the gypsy moths are up to.
Sure. So various parts of the state, and I know sections here in Charlton, and I know in my hometown of Sturbridge over the last few years, we've been hit not one year, but several subsequent years of heavy defoliation by the gypsy moths. And in Sturbridge, it has led to some significant tree mortality, not only along our public streets, but also in the wooded areas of private property. We're looking, some areas of town have up to 10 or 15 acres of completely dead oak trees now in a forested area. Kind of fairly devastating. The gypsy moth has, like anything in nature, it needs to stay in balance, and when nature gets out of balance, things get out of whack. And that's really, in a 30-second soundbite, what has happened to the gypsy moth. Up until the last 2 springs, the previous 5 springs were somewhat on the dry side. And one of the years we actually experienced a drought of well over 9 to 10 inches below normal rainfall, which is somewhere around 20% of the rainfall we normally receive. So one year we ended with a 20% drought of normal rainfall. That did a couple things, is the natural bacteria and fungus that help control the gypsy moth. Obviously that needs moisture to survive and to do its magic on the gypsy moth. That didn't happen, and then the trees that got defoliated needed the water to replenish their reserves and moisture so that they could put out a second flush of leaves and continue to have the starches and sugars in their root systems for the next spring's also flush of leaves. So when the drought prevented those trees from getting those reserves back, that continued to weaken and stress those trees to the point where they just didn't survive, and after a few years. The good news is about 2 years ago, we finally got just the right weather conditions, and we had a pretty good mortality in the gypsy moth population. What I noticed in Sturbridge was the more rural the area, the more control there was, in that the bacteria and fungus usually live in the duff of the forest floor. So the trees that were close to or in the forest had really good mortality of the gypsy moth. However, trees that were in lawns, landscaped areas, traffic islands between parking lots, those trees weren't that well affected by the bacteria, because when the caterpillar leaves the tree on a hot day and goes to the ground, it's not a natural forest duff, so that's not the prime environment for the bacteria and the fungus to live in. This year, over the last week, I have noticed in Sturbridge some gypsy moth mortality. For the most part, they were around, but nowhere near the numbers that really present a nuisance value. I mean, there was some chewing of leaves and some droppings, but nowhere near, even a 25% defoliation, which is good for the trees. Obviously, this spring, I think we could all agree, has been generally a wet and colder spring, so that delayed the gypsy moth, one, at their hatching period, and two, their life cycle of molting 5 or 6 times. So that delayed, which means they're slightly smaller in size than what we have seen in the past, comparatively speaking, to this time of year. And now with the rain and the frequent rains we're still getting, the bacteria and the fungus basically is doing its thing. We're getting some pretty good reports right now from the field of general gypsy moth mortality. So if we can continue this humid weather, which will get the gypsy moths out of the trees and into the ground or down in the ground, and get a couple more days with some thunderstorms coming through to keep the leaf litter moist and viable for the fungus and bacteria, we should get a really good control of the gypsy moth this year. And hopefully we can say, we can look at it in the rearview mirror and say we are finally done with this cycle of severe infestation.
Well, if we are done with this cycle, will we have a few years respite?
So the short answer to that is yes. I think the longer answer is, if we didn't have the 5 years of drought, we never would have had this cycle. Okay, so as long as we maintain a normal wet spring, early June weather cycle, that should, as it has in the past, keep the gypsy moth in check and control. What created this cycle is the fact that we had a couple, 3 years of very dry springs, and that didn't provide the moisture that the bacteria and the fungus needed to activate to affect a good control of the gypsy moth. So as long as we maintain a very normal rain pattern, we should be good for the foreseeable future.
Well, that's not a problem. We just call up the AccuWeather guy, weather guy, tell him to just give us that.
So I could make that forecast, but nowhere near the money, right?
Well, die, gypsy moths, die. That's all I can say. You want to say anything about the trails? We got a couple of minutes left.
Sure.
A lot of people don't know how great the trails are around here.
So, thank you. In Sturbridge, we have a very active trails committee, and fortunately it is funded by the residents through the Community Preservation Act, which Sturbridge adopted several years ago, and also funded through our betterment hotel motel tax. So clearly, Sturbridge is taking advantage of that opportunity. It's acquired just over 2,000 acres of open space. And we have a trail guide that's available on the trails website. The address is www.sturbridgetrails.org. And our guide has the maps and trail information of 9 pieces of property, not only owned by the town, but by the Army Corps of Engineers, Wells State Park, you know, and our Opakam Land Trust, our local land trust. And all of their properties are in the guide with a trail map and description of the trails. So Sturbridge right now is pretty fortunate to have just over 30 miles of trails, and a variety of trails, from rail trails, a very wide, easy walking, you know, very low grade, you know, very easy to bring the strollers and the baby carriages, or, you know, for elderly to just go out and walk a section of the trail, to some of the more technical single track trails. One that comes to mind is, we call it the Knife Edge Trail. And it basically follows a very sharp rock outcrop for a distance that you know, provides that kind of really backcountry remote hiking experience, and everything in between.
Do any of them go up to Charlton?
Um,
I mean,
So we are, the short answer is Sturbridge is partnered with the Trail Committee in Southbridge. I don't know that we've had any real conversation with anyone in Charlton, but I know the Trail Committee would invite a meeting with Charlton folks to see where we could make connections, if there is some possible. Absolutely.
very good. Well, this has been the Long Hill Report, and we've had an informative half hour with Tom Chamberlain. And so this is Richard Morco saying thank you for watching, and thank you, Tom, for being with us.
Thank you for having me on the show.